In the words of Somali-British poet Watson Chittick, no one leaves home unless home is the mouth of a shark. For a long time, I interpreted this powerful quote as a poignant depiction of the refugee experience, one that explores the fractured relationship between a displaced person and the places they call home. Chittick's words have resonated with generations of people who were forced to flee their countries due to the destructive legacy of imperialism and colonialism, even as they carried the anthem under their breath. Today, Chittick's poem Home can be reinterpreted to explain the current wave of gentrification in public housing and the insidious cycle of displacement that denies migrants and others the right to belong. The issue of public housing hits home for many people who were raised in high-density living and have witnessed its transformation from a basic human necessity into a commodity that is a part of an increasingly expensive housing market. Social housing came during a time where rapid industrialization met mass production, and modern architects who were committed to a form follows function doctrine began to treat housing like products made in factories.
In other words, stop thinking about the way a building looks and think instead about what it does.
They designed what they thought of as the most efficient and best functioning housing and reproduced it en masse. This is why most high-rise buildings, from Paris to Melbourne, look strikingly familiar. The architectural and spatial qualities of social housing often produces identical and bleak rows of high-rise towers with dark and narrow hallways that seek to separate neighbours rather than bringing them together. The units were historically built to fit the white nuclear family, a family structure that consists of 2 parents and 2 children. So, when newer and bigger family types began to resettle in the global north, ethnic families often bore the brunt of living in overcrowded homes. These kinds of living arrangements have significant influences on children who, without peaceful and private spaces to study, are more likely to achieve lower educational outcomes, as well as an increased risk of developing psychological stress, sleep disturbance, and infectious diseases. In an interview that I conducted a while back, Melbourne-based youth worker Idil Ali spoke to me about the overcrowding in relation to the March 2020 COVID-19 tower lockdowns, where 9 high-rise buildings in North Melbourne and Flemington placed residents under an immediate lockdown for 5 days. Idil, who was raised in the Carlton Flats and is now working alongside the youth living in the estates, recounts the community's calls for preemptive action against the pandemic.
What people will tell you who work in this space is from February, people were saying, hey, we noticed that COVID numbers are going up, we have a lot of shared spaces in the building. We should get, hand sanitizer. We should get, things in place. Literally community members were talking about it really early on because they were like, okay, well, we have a lot of elderly people who live in these buildings. We have a lot of overcrowding, which obviously they know because they overcrowd us. Mm-hmm. So if COVID reaches the buildings, it's actually concerning for our community members. And they're not doing anything, mind you. Mm-hmm. Not a thing.
So when the COVID numbers started to rise, an ombudsman report revealed that the decision to detain people with no warning was driven purely by politics, not public health. In fact, the deputy chief officer had less than 15 minutes to approve the directive before the press conference was held, and 500 police officers were deployed to enforce a lockdown on every single floor of every high-rise building. This was particularly traumatic for the overcriminalized youth who had a bad relationship with the police and the tower residents, some of whom survived dictatorships and civil wars and were overwhelmed by heavy police presence. So Melbourne, the Bronx, and Grenfell, where does it all connect? If we engage in a meaningful comparison between London's Grenfell tragedy, New York's Bronx fire, and Melbourne's COVID-19 high-rise tower lockdowns, we can see how the public housing crisis transcends national borders into a problem far more pervasive than we initially assumed. In January of 2022, when news spread about the tragic Bronx fires that claimed the lives of 17 mostly Gambian Muslim residents from a tight-knit estate, grievers across the US and the UK drew parallels between the fire and the Grenfell inferno that had occurred nearly 5 years prior. Grenfell was the first to highlight the economic and political realities of London's housing estates, and it catalysed a global conversation about social housing under a Thatcher-inspired laissez-faire economic system. So using post-Grenfell frameworks, the public were able to identify the inextricable link between the Bronx space heater fire and a failure to uphold proper building regulations and conduct. Neither of the buildings had fire sprinkler systems, functioning fire extinguishers, or an alarm system. In Grenfell, this was compounded by flammable and non-compliant material, faulty wiring, and a lack of fire safety procedures. In Melbourne, where the Department of Health and Human Services acts as a landlord to housing estates, there are similarities to be drawn in relation to its history of building negligence and lack of maintenance. Tenants and community workers in Melbourne had alerted the Department of Health and Human Services about the risks of COVID-19 spreading in disinvested, unmaintained, high-density towers, which was left unacknowledged until it was too late.
Literally, community members were talking about it really early on because they were like, okay, well, we have a lot of elderly people who live in these buildings. We have a lot of overcrowding, which obviously they know because they overcrowd us. Mm-hmm. So if COVID reaches the buildings, like, it's actually concerning for our community members. And they're not doing anything, mind you. Mm-hmm. Not a thing. When the public housing lockdown happened, and straight away before the announcement was even made, mind you, there was already police on the estate. Like, people were like, why are this many police here? They thought something happened. So everyone was like confused. You would have seen, like, obviously on people's like Instagrams and social medias and stuff, they were saying like, oh, why the police here? But then obviously the announcement gets made. There's police on every single floor at the bottom of every building. Mm-hmm. And it's terrifying. And the scary part was, like, you were confident enough to do it to this extent. But then it's also like the owners of the buildings is the Department of Housing. Like, what's the dialogue between Department of Housing and the police? And time again, we're seeing that the Department of Housing allows police free reins of the buildings. The police need a warrant to come into your house, but they don't need it to come into your building. They don't need it to come into your floors. And they finesse ways to not need it.
These sorts of incidents demonstrate a callous disregard for the safety of public housing tenants. And it outlines the ways in which the political establishments in their respective countries view their lives as disposable and unimportant. As a response, Ilir Ali speaks about the importance of community resistance in spaces that are adamant to push us out.
I think the biggest lesson I learned from it was like if you don't argue, if you don't like fight for yourself, the amount of things that would happen to us is ridiculous. If we don't resist, like, I'm like, if you don't stand up for yourself, if you don't stand up communally, like, the amount of harm we would experience if we depended on the fairness or the kindness of people in power is ridiculous.
Gentrification and quote-unquote redevelopments were strong themes in the last 2 seasons of Netflix's Top Boy. Committed to a cycle of disinvestment, demolition and privatisation, estate redevelopments are one of the most common ways residents are forced out of their homes to live in faraway suburbs that diminish their social networks and their sense of belonging.
Because San Francisco is engaging, as most northern cities now are engaged, in something called urban renewal, which means moving the Negroes out. It means Negro removal. That is what it means.
In season 1, the issue was not explicitly spoken about, but rather it was alluded to by the camera focus and the non-verbal acting. A notable scene is when Duchesne comes back to the Summerhouse Estates after a few years and he notices the early signs of gentrification, such as newcomers who are white and seemingly wealthy, an increased cost of living, new shops that have replaced the old ones, and of course, hipster cafes. And we also hear a little bit about a potential redevelopment from the more affluent characters in casual conversation.
Sorry I'm late. Meeting went long. Putting together a consortium of investors to redevelop one of the local estates, like a total regeneration. Where do we get to?
However, in season 2, it escalates into a central issue that the Summerhouse residents, including Duchesne's mum, are trying to resist. It shows how subtle, slow, and seemingly harmless gentrification is in its early stages, but how quickly it can become violent during the final run. It also opens up an intriguing conversation about the inner workings of Black capitalism as we watch Duchesne's transformation from a young man raised in the Summerhouse Estates to now an investor in the redevelopment who is more than willing to demolish and gentrify an estate that gave him so much.
Just for the record, Summerhouse is a shithole. I'm actually doing everyone a favour around here by knocking it down and rebuilding it and making it better for everyone.
You spend your whole youth selling drugs to make money out of this estate. And now you're selling it to make more money. Well, this is my home. This is where I raised you and your brother. This is where I live.
This discussion also extends to grime artist Stormzy and his politically charged performance at the 2018 Brit Awards. It was an ode to the victims of Grenfell, where Stormzy slammed Theresa May's government for their unfulfilled promises for Grenfell and their attempt to erase the tragedy from the nation's memory. One line from Stormzy's rap, where he says, "You criminals, and you got the cheek to call us savages," stuck out to me because it really does highlight the ethnocentric ideas surrounding immigrant residents that predates the dark colonial history of the UK, the US, and Australia. This really showed itself when the Australian Senator Pauline Hanson justified the Melbourne Tower lockdowns by labelling the tenants as drug addicts and alcoholics who did not know how to speak English and therefore could not follow COVID-19 protocol. But just across the street from the towers, private residents who were living in their newly gentrified buildings were given nearly 8 hours to prepare for their own stay-at-home directions. It really does reveal the state's desire to paternalize and exert control over ethnic minorities, especially when they do not have ownership of their homes. Cultural sociologist Stuart Hall continues to build on this link between colonialism and housing injustice. He states that they are here because you were there. There is an umbilical connection. There is no understanding Englishness without understanding its imperial and colonial dimensions. So when the media tells Stormzy, and by extension all immigrant social housing residents, that they should be grateful for the opportunities and especially the housing given to him by the charitable West, it reveals the conditional basis of our acceptance in these countries. It is, however, very crucial to remember Hall's words, as it tells us that our existence in the global north is a byproduct of the exploitation, extortion, and destruction of our home countries, and we have a legitimate claim in the places that we exist today.